Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. Most of us will have probably seen the Walt Disney film Mary Poppins. Released in 1964 and set in London in 1910, it gives a partial glimpse into what life was like in the Edwardian period. And there's touches on some of the social changes taking place when Winifred Banks returns to her home after a suffragette rally. What was life really like living through the Edwardian period? Well, here to tell us more about the Edwardian period, I'm delighted to be joined by Alwyn Turner. Alwyn is a cultural and political historian, senior lecturer in history at the University of Chichester, and is author of the book Little Englanders, Britain in the Edwardian Era. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Alwyn.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me.
It's great to have you on. I think I mentioned before the podcast that I really enjoyed listening to your Little Englanders book. And it brought sort of some of the black and white images that I had when my grandparents were alive into colour with some of the stuff. So, yeah,
that's nice.
Really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
That's great.
Good.
During my research, actually, I mean, this isn't to do with the Edwardians. I mean, I was reading your site all about trash fiction. And numerous books that you had on, and there's one or two there that I remember from the early 70s, growing up as a child of the early 70s, books like Suedehead and Skinhead, which were musts at the time.
Yeah, no, very much part of that texture of the times. Skinhead sold 1 million copies and must have been read by 8 million people, I think.
Wow.
They used to get passed around the playgrounds, those sort of books, along with the Sven Hassel.
Yeah. I remember it well. The Crombie coats and all the rest of it, the tonic trousers. Anyway, we digress a little bit. So thank you for coming on the show. Before we talk about your latest book, could you just tell us a bit about you, your life's journey, and how you became interested in the history of Britain in the 20th century, please?
I guess just by living through it. I've always been obsessed with my culture. Part of it, I think, is I grew up in Germany mostly. My father was a musician in the British Army. And back in the 1960s and 70s, into the 80s in Germany, we didn't have English language television. We had one radio station, BFBS radio for the forces. And consequently, I was reliant on a lot of recorded material for my entertainment rather than broadcast material. My dad had a big box of reel-to-reel tapes, if you remember those, with hundreds of hours of Tony Hancock and the Goons and stuff from that vintage from before my time, kind of a decade or so before. And he had 78 records, those 10-inch 78 records of a lot of Sandy Powell, the old Lancashire comedian, but also Arthur Askey and various others. And so even as a child, I was kind of steeped in the popular culture of a generation before me. And I think that stuck somewhat. And a lot of my reading at the time was, I was obsessed with Sherlock Holmes from the age of 10, as any young boy should be.
Absolutely.
And John Buchan and all of that stuff. A lot of my stuff has always been, my taste has always been in that Edwardian period to start with, and in that tradition that is largely disappeared now of the music hall and popular fiction, and it's always meant a great deal to me.
It's interesting. I mean, the Edwardian period to me was always slightly black and white. I didn't really know an awful lot about it because you had the big Victorian period throughout a majority of, or 2/3 of the 19th century, and then you had the First World War, and that bit in between, you often hear about, oh yeah, that's an Edwardian architecture, that's an Edwardian building. But I didn't know a lot about the actual sort of days, day to day for ordinary people, and a huge amount happened. But first of all, what when we say about the Edwardian period, what dates are we looking at?
I'm using it kind of broadly between, I guess, 1900. The Queen Victoria died at the beginning of 1901. So it's that the first decade of the 20th century, and then even though Edward is no longer on the throne, up to 1914, because really nothing changes because there's been a change of king in 1910. So it's broadly it's 1900 to 1914.
Yeah. And before we talk about some of the subjects within the period, could we just talk a little bit about Edward VII himself? Because there seem to be a lot of parallels with our own time, in as much as, you know, we had a very long, well, the longest running monarch in history, and then the Prince of Wales took over, who was also a very long running Prince of Wales, and it was very similar, wasn't it, in the early 20th century?
Yes, I mean even more pronounced then, obviously, because Queen Victoria defined that period so heavily in a way that a modern monarch obviously cannot. But also, I think because Queen Victoria died at the beginning of the century, the Edwardians viewed the 20th century as starting in January 1901, and Victoria died in February, I think, 1901, right at the beginning of the century. And that century had been so dramatic and so intense that it felt like a proper full stop. And that was, people were conscious even then that was the end of an era. Britain had transformed so heavily during Victoria's time. And then there's this, as you say, a man who has spent a great deal of time as Prince of Wales. Is the longest serving at that stage Prince of Wales, only eclipsed by the current king. So people knew him. He wasn't an unknown quantity. And people had a very definite idea of him, and they knew that he was not the same as his mother, who had been close to being a recluse for decades. And here was a man who was seen out in public and was larger than life and a bon vivant and all the rest, even though obviously by the time he got to be king, he was slowing down somewhat. He was getting on. But there was a very definite image of him and an awareness that he would be different to his mother. The 20th century would be different to the 19th. It's just nobody quite knows what it will be like and how that's going to play out. But there is definitely a sense that we are passing from one age to another.
Edward himself, what was he like as a person?
My interest in him, as in others in this time, is the public perception of him as much as the reality, if you see what I mean. And he's seen as being this ebullient figure. The press were far more respectful in those days than they would be now, and the tales of his affairs and so on were not aired publicly. But there was an awareness that he was a man who liked ladies, that he was a sportsman, that he enjoyed physical pleasures and some fairly common cultural tastes. He liked the musical. He invited musical stars to come and perform for him at Windsor. And there's a sense of not quite a playboy prince, because, as I say, he was not a young man by the time he got to be king. But there was a sense of him being almost a kind of John Bullish, Henry VIII-ish type figure. He was large. He seemed very, very assured of himself and much more public than his mother had been.
Some parallels there with Charles II after the 1660s.
Yes, and I think that does happen in the beginning of the 20th century in the Edwardian times. That a sense of the lid being lifted off. We can relax a bit more now.
Yeah,
the old woman of Windsor is no longer looking over us and faintly disapproving.
Yeah,
Edward VII was amused.
A huge amount of subjects to talk about, and obviously the best thing to do would be to read the book. Edward's legacy. You mentioned there about how he, the lid had come off and he was amused. How did that affect the sort of British public at the time, do you think?
There had been a move already. You can feel a sense of impatience with what seemed to be the unreasonable expectations of high Victorian moral values. I think one of the most characteristic accounts of the time is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is mid-1880s. But Dr. Jekyll, in that, his offences that require him to create this extra incarnation of himself as Hyde, where he can throw off normal proprieties and behave as he wishes, his offences are so minor. His best friend likes wine and won't drink it in order to deny himself that pleasure. I mean, it's on that kind of level. It's the demands that were made on people by that moral and ethical code that had come in from the evangelical revival a century before and had taken over certainly respectable society. People were becoming impatient with that. They were recognising it was an impossible ideal to live up to, and that they needed to relax. They needed a certain amount of indulgence. Life does allow for some licence. And I think the combination of a change of monarch and a change of century allows, as I said, a relaxation, I think is probably the best way of describing it. There's a sense that we don't have to be quite so uptight and upright. We can have fun as well. And a lot of the time is a lot of it is to do with that kind of growing sense of leisure is all right.
Do you think we were discussing that we both sort of had grandparents that lived through that period when they were young? I always sensed in the sort of 1960s and 1970s that there was still a legacy of that strict moral code in terms of manners and all the rest of it, which I think, and you'd be a good person to ask this, sort of started breaking down more in the 1960s with the sort of Cultural Revolution then. It seemed to take a long time to sort of get rid of all that, didn't it?
It did. It kept on coming back. I mean, there was the two world wars produced a relaxation of moral standards, and then in the immediate aftermath, a reaction against that, an attempt to reassert the old values. And they were reasserted to diminishing effect, but it did mean that the 1950s was a time of trying to get back to that state. By that stage, the Edwardian period in particular had come to be seen as some kind of lost paradise before 1914 destroyed everything.
Yeah.
And I think some of it was that as well. It's not simply an assertion of morality for its own sake, but also a belief that we might be able to recapture the lost world that we once enjoyed.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be cyclical, doesn't it? This sort of periods of uptightness and strict moral codes, and then all of a sudden we let go. And we look back now at the 1970s.
Yeah, it did. Obviously, all of these things go through cycles and repetitions. There are only so many variations on human nature,
yes.
Human society.
The Edwardian period was an interesting time from a political point of view, and your book captures some of that. Could you just sort of describe to listeners in a nutshell what was happening?
The really big shift, I think, is a growing assertion by the working class and a demand that they should also be involved in the political process. So you have the birth of the Labour Party, and it's not that significant in itself. It has dozens of MPs rather than hundreds. But its very existence, at a time when people know that the franchise is going to be widened at some point in the near future, the existence of the Labour Party then means that the Liberal Party has to move further to the left in order to see off this threat that is emerging, and does so remarkably well. And you have the Liberal government that is elected in 1906 and effectively runs through into the war, although there are a couple of general elections in between that reduces the size of the Liberal government. But that government is the one that lays the foundations for the welfare state. You have the introduction of old age pensions, you have the introduction of national insurance. These are the foundations of the world that we now have. And they come from the Liberals understanding that the old way of economic organisation is no longer sufficient. We cannot simply have the state removing itself entirely from economic and social life and hoping that charity will pick up the problems that have emerged with the emergence of industrialisation and urbanisation. There has to be something else, and that the state is the best way of delivering some kind of stable society. And that seems to me the biggest change of all in there.
Yeah.
But running alongside that, there is the campaign to extend the franchise, both in terms of the working class and also of women. And then there is the other great tension of the time, which is the status of Ireland, which is becoming increasingly committed to the idea of some sort of devolution of power, not necessarily independence at this stage, but home rule, which is the equivalent of Scottish devolution in the present time, where it's still part of the country, but it has its own parliament. Those demands are becoming ever more pressing and ever more threatening because there are people wishing to resist that heavily. So it's quite it's a time of conflicts that are not quite resolved. All of those issues are still up in the air when the war breaks out in 1914.
Yes. And the other thing that is quite interesting is that I'd always made the assumption that the British Empire as it was beginning, and certainly from an industrial point of view, was really beginning to lose ground in the 1960s with Japanese cars coming in and all the rest of it. And yet there seems to be a feeling almost, certainly through the book, that we were beginning to not be deemed as important as we were in the 19th century from a sort of international point of view.
Yeah, I mean, by the beginning of the 20th century, America has a bigger economy than Britain. Has just overtaken it. And Germany is coming up very fast.
Yeah.
And Germany is the real threat because America is kind of understandable. It is so much bigger as a nation. And because it is part of the Anglophone family. And also it's quite a long way removed. It's not a threat to Britain. Germany is seen as being a threat fairly early on. Because the economy is growing so rapidly, because the population is growing so rapidly, and because clearly Germany is feeling that it has lost out in the race for empire. It has some colonial possessions, but not as much as it wants. And it needs, it seems from Britain, it is looking for an expansion. And that can only come at the expense of the British. And so although the empire is still by far the biggest entity in the world, there are these challenges emerging, and one of them is only just over the water.
And do you think was this sort of put in the daily newspapers in terms of a possible threat from Germany quite early on in the Edwardian period? Were there certain people that were prophesying, suggesting that something could happen at the time, or was it largely overlooked?
No, it was very heavily covered. It was in the newspapers. The Daily Mail, in particular, was thundering against Germany from a very early stage. But more than that, it was there in the boys' story magazines. The boys' own paper and all the ones that span off from that, and the Magnet and the Gem and all, which was the stuff that the kids used to read before comics were invented.
Yeah.
They would read these story papers, and there was a sense growing even within that Germany was the threat, Germany was going to come, and conflict was probably inevitable in Europe.
Right.
I mean, not that people wanted it, that people were looking for it, but there was a growing sense that it was probably going to be necessary at some stage.
Yeah.
And because Britain hadn't been involved in a really major conflict for so long. I mean, since Waterloo in 1815, we're talking nearly a century of peace and stability within Britain and Europe. The colonial conflicts and at the beginning of the Edwardian period, there is the Boer War in particular. But that long period of peace had kind of left people slightly maybe forgetful of the reality of war. It was not seen as being quite as damaging, as destructive, as appalling as it might have been a couple of generations earlier, because there was no experience of it.
Yeah. And you mentioned there, Alwyn, a little bit about the Daily Mail. And I remember hearing about the fact that was a new newspaper, I believe, and was sort of slightly different to the old established ones.
It was. It was starts in the 1890s, and by the Edwardian times, it had established itself as the dominant paper in terms of sales. It was the first to hit a circulation of 1 million. And that was a long way ahead of any of its rivals. That made it a significant player. It was not approved of by the establishment. It wasn't a proper newspaper like the Times or the Daily Telegraph, which had been around for some time. But it was impossible to ignore it because it represented clearly a very large swathe of opinion in Britain. It was a time of near universal literacy. By the end of the 19th century, virtually everybody was literate.
Yeah,
there was a new market opening for such popular newspapers. And the Daily Mail was a really significant voice, and largely because it represented its readers, which obviously a newspaper should do, but it wasn't necessarily obvious at the time. If you read the Times at this period, you will get an 18,000-word account of what happened in Parliament yesterday. The Daily Mail didn't have time for that. It did much shorter articles, much more direct, and it was as much about expressing readers' opinions and readers' prejudices as filtered through the proprietor who was in touch with that, which is the secret of a great popular newspaper, is a proprietor and an editor who understand the audience and come from the same place. And the Mail was not interested in passing down this is what the great and the good did yesterday, and you must pay attention. It was more. It was demanding that the great and the good should pay attention to us.
So it was actually challenging.
That was, and that's a big development in newspaper history, but also in terms of democracy, because it's from that the entire 20th century obsession with newspapers in Britain grows. And the whole point of them is they do have a place in a democratic society. That is one way of communicating from the bottom up, as opposed to the Times' position in the 19th century, which had been very much from the top downwards, or at least if it was going to criticise those at the top, it was doing so from the position of equality.
Yes,
the editor of the Times mattered because he was part of the establishment. Yeah. The editor of the Daily Mail mattered because he didn't really care too much about being part of, and therefore he was prepared to articulate his readers' concerns.
And that was a sort of newspaper read by, in quotes, the ordinary working people.
Well, certainly the ordinary middle class and the kind of the upper levels of the working class. Yes,
yeah,
and by women, which was an important part of this business as well. Was here's a section of society that hadn't really been very represented in newspapers, magazines, but not newspapers, and so that sense of people being included, which is very much what the Edwardians are trying to figure their way towards. I think, as I say, there is this sense it's a new century, it's a new era. We don't quite know what it's going to be, but it should be more inclusive than it was in the past. Society has to broaden those to whom it is prepared to pay attention and whose voices should be heard. Moving
on to some of the technological advancements, I I think two of them were invented in the 19th century. But, you look at the telephone, the motor car, and aviation. I mean, they were pretty big things that happened, weren't they? In terms of, starting to almost democratise them a little bit and make them more accessible.
Yes, and to shrink the world. Distance is no longer so important. If you can pick up the telephone and speak to somebody in Aberdeen and you're in Surrey, this is an extraordinary development. It would have taken you a couple of days to get a letter to them in the past, let alone to go and see them. And if you were wealthy enough that you could afford transportation, in the days of horses, that meant your social circle is restricted to how far a horse can go and come back on the same day, which gives you about a 10, 15-mile radius. Now you've got a car. That just expands your field of social activity and therefore shrinks the size of the country. And aviation is not commercially a serious thing at this stage, but clearly that is going to do the same to the world as well.
Yes.
The time is coming when you will be able to fly over the Atlantic, although it is not yet here.
Yeah.
And that's going to completely it's shrinking things and at the same time homogenizing.
Yes.
I mean, I think the real technological changes that transform the country are not simply in that, but also in the idea that entertainment can now be recorded. You have gramophone records. You also have cylinders right at the beginning, but they don't last. And you have film. So entertainment is no longer simply a live interaction between a performer on stage and an audience. It is now fixed. The audience doesn't matter at all in that context. The same film can be shown all over the country, all over the world. The same record can be heard. And that again shrinks it because it means that regional variation is much less important. What you need is something that will appeal regardless of regional tastes and idiosyncrasies. You've got to have something that will appeal right across the board. And that although that's still in its infancy, there are people at the time already saying this is going to damage the identity of cities and towns and regions, that we're going to lose the richness and the variety of the nation.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we still talk about these days, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, a lot of although the technology has obviously changed beyond comprehension, the fears are still the same. There's still the same concern that small children are going to the cinema and seeing horrible things being played out on the screens, and this is going to destroy their lives. It will completely change the nature of society. We're all going to hell in a handcart because of the horrors that they are witnessing on the screen. That's still with us, and somehow society has still survived, which I think is one of the lessons that one should take from history, is panics and imminent catastrophes can be exaggerated.
Etiquette and manners. I was reading something about, and this wasn't in your book, Alwyn, but that men didn't shake hands in the Edwardian period and women always wore gloves when they met people. Is that correct?
Men had become very fearful of personal contact, largely because of the trial of Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde's trial was so powerful as a social event that it changed how people behaved. Prior to that, it was perfectly normal for men to walk down the street arm in arm. Wilde was considered so horrific and so far out of bounds that people changed how they behaved, and men were fearful of physical contact after that because it might give the wrong impression.
It had that much impact.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and was remembered as such. In the 1950s, there was when people were discussing the Wolfenden Report and whether homosexuality should be legalised and all of that. There were people in the House of Lords saying, I remember when I was at Oxford in 1905, This simply wasn't talked about, and it didn't happen because of Oscar Wilde. It just this blanket just descended on and smothered so much, which is one of the reasons I start the book with the death of Oscar Wilde,
Yes.
because I do think his shadow does hang over this period, even though nobody wishes to talk about it, and there is an absolute silence. It turns up in E.M. Forster's novel Morris, which is his homosexual novel that was not published until after he died, but was written around about 1910. And at one point, the title character confesses to his doctor, "I'm an unspeakable of the Oscar Wilde variety." He's become almost a medical term. He really is a huge figure, and as I say, nobody's prepared to talk about it, but there's an absence there. Sorry, I've come a long way from ladies wearing gloves, which I think is also true, but there is it's kind of going almost against that process of loosening up and relaxation of morals. There is also that other thing. There is one area that we must be careful that we do not tread anywhere near this territory.
Yeah. Taboo subject. And entertainment itself was quite, I know we touched on it earlier on, but entertainment itself, I was, I heard that bit about, I keep saying reading, but I listened to your book. I heard the bit about this little boy who was basically, I don't know whether you can say the word now, he was a fat little boy.
The Fat Boy of Peckham.
Fat Boy of Peckham. I mean, could you just tell listeners a bit about that?
This was he's one of the great early tabloid stories, and the Daily Mail, although it's not tabloid format, it is establishing the values and the tradition of the tabloid newspaper. This boy from Peckham in South London, the age of 5, is reported that he is growing at an alarming rate. He's very large. He's heavy. He's tall, and he's referred to as the Fat Boy of Peckham. And as soon as he is, the music halls become interested, because music halls are providing. The whole point of a music hall is you have a variety bill. You might have as many as 20 or more acts on in a single evening, and there will be people singing songs and dances and jugglers and all the rest. But you also get these kind of almost freak show kind of acts. Yeah. And the Fat Boy of Peckham, John Trundley as he was called, becomes one of those. He appears on stage. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't have an act. He's just there being very big. He comes on wearing a sailor suit, and then halfway through he takes off the sailor suit and he's wearing a body stocking, so you can see just how big he is.
Yeah.
And that's it. And then, as is characteristic with a proper tabloid story, there is then a twist, because then he has to go to school. And it is discovered that he is not capable of walking to the tram stop that will get him a tram to the local school that he's got to go to, because he's too big and he's not fit enough. So they have to extend the tram line to his house. And then he becomes a tabloid story all over again, because then he has he's a drain on municipal funds, and it's an appalling use of public spending and all the rest. And this poor kid, by the age of 6, has been through the entire cycle of being lionized and then demonized by the tabloid press in a way that is still incredibly familiar. This becomes a pattern, but he's one of the very first to be in this position. And yeah, he's deserves to be remembered, I think.
Yeah, it's a sad story, really.
Yeah, I mean, on the other side of it, he earned a lot of money doing so. His father was a dustman, who was not well, and could afford to retire and live off his son's earnings, because his son was being paid very large sums to appear on stage, and his son did stay in entertainment for some time afterwards. When he left school, he did appear in some stage comedies in the 1920s. even a couple of movies, but in a very minor capacity, and died in the 1930s at what was then a reasonable age. And so it doesn't end in tragedy, but it is deeply uncomfortable. And people knew that at the time as well, which I think is also important. The musicals that put him on were taken to court for exploiting him under legislation designed to protect child performers. And the case didn't work because the judge said he's not a performer, he's just a freak show. And unfortunately, the law doesn't cover that. It only covers those who have an act. So it was not entirely satisfactory, but nonetheless, it is important to note that people did know that this was not good. It's not that everybody thought everything's fine. There were those who recognised that
sort of social conscience.
It did not reflect well on society.
Yeah. One question I've got about people in their work in terms of employment. How did employment change in the first part of that decade in terms of obviously in the 19th century, a lot of people, or even at the end of the 18th century, people were moving away from the fields to cities and factories and things like that. Were there any changes between the Edwardian period about what sorts of jobs people did? Were there any new jobs? Did people change? Were they forced to change?
There's a growth of clerical work, of office work. Because we now have, you mentioned the telephone, we also have the typewriter. Dictaphones are starting to come into existence. There is an office technology, and there are growing numbers of people engaged in what we would now refer to as white-collar work, but still at a very low pay. So still part of a working class, but no longer a manual working class. And a rise of women in that context as well. These are now jobs that women can do. Women working in offices becomes a thing. And so you do get this a slight shift towards the emergence of what will become a kind of a lower middle class field of employment. Salesman, again, is another growth area for employment. Advertising has made this more plausible. And again, it all ties in with the rise of the Daily Mail and other newspapers. Advertising becomes much more important than it had been. Therefore, you have to have more people selling. There is a move away from manual work, although obviously that is still massive. And still the biggest employer of women at this stage is domestic service. That whole servant economy is still really huge, and it's not until the 1920s that it starts to decline.
Yeah.
And the numbers are reduced. Although there are, even in the Edwardian times, you're starting to get those kind of self-contained serviced flats being built in West London and places like that, where young people who previously would have had a servant no longer do. There's not a maid. There might be a woman who comes in and cleans, but that's as far as you go. So there's the start of a move away from that servant economy as well, but it is still very, very big.
Legacy of the Edwardian period in terms of the people. So if you took three people out of the Edwardian period and you feel that it made a great impact to it,
my great hero in this era, heroine, is Marie Lloyd, the Queen of the Music Halls, who I think is as close as Britain ever got to the Marilyn Monroe, the great embodiment of joie de vivre in the working classes and beyond. So I think Marie Lloyd, probably the greatest female entertainer that Britain has ever produced, and therefore is relevant. I think Arthur Conan Doyle, because Sherlock Holmes, although he belongs to an earlier era, comes back largely due to fan pressure in a way that is also quite familiar to the modern world. The audience demands that he be revived, and Sherlock Holmes is so massive and shapes so much of the literature that will come. I think Conan Doyle, and also he's writing other great stuff at this time as well. And the one who really fascinates me in this period politically is Horatio Bottomley, who is of no great significance as a politician at all, but is just a fascinating rogue of a character who comes from nothing. I mean, orphaned at a very early age, runs away from the orphanage, makes a huge sum of money in the city of London with these fraudulent investment schemes that he will claim that he's exploiting a gold mine in Australia. And there is no such mine, but he gets massive amounts of money that is invested in him, and most of it he steals. And then he ends up getting himself elected as a Liberal MP and establishing his own newspaper. And the man is a complete rogue and a rotter. But people love him because he's ebullient and larger than life. Kenneth Graham has said that he largely based Toad of Toad Hall on Horatio Bottomley. There is And it makes perfect sense. He has that kind of character. He's short and he's squat and he's loud, and he doesn't care that in Parliament he's cold-shouldered by his own party, let alone the opposition. Nobody likes him. Everybody knows that he's a crook. But anybody who says that he's a crook, he'll sue them for libel. He'll defend himself in court, and he'll normally win because he is so charming and so persuasive. And there's something rather attractive about him, despite everything, despite the fact that he loses his parliamentary seat not through an election. He gets huge votes in an election, largely because he's bribing the electorate. But he loses his seat not because he's voted out, but because he's declared bankrupt after he finally loses a court case. And so he gets thrown out. And then, which comes after the period of the book, but he reinvents himself. During the First World War, he becomes one of the biggest and most important live speakers. He holds these rallies where he's encouraging people to volunteer to start with, and then to subscribe to war bonds and to invest. He makes a huge amount of money out of this because he charged a very substantial fee to make a speech. And then finally comes a cropper in the 1920s when it's discovered that all the money that he was raising for war bonds, he was taking a cut of that as well and cheating his ordinary people. That was the bit that really got him. Everybody knew he was a crook, but he was stealing money from those who had sufficient funds that they could afford to lose it. They were people who were investing, expecting a quick, fast buck. He was exploiting their gullibility, and that was okay. But when he starts exploiting the working class, the people who read his newspaper, he lost all respect and ended up in jail. Anyway, I find Horatio Bottomley just a fascinating character who's not particularly well remembered, but should be.
Well, there's lots more we could talk about, Alwyn. In your work as a lecturer, I guess this is the sort of stuff you're talking about. I guess cultural history, political history over the last sort of 120 years.
Yes, that's kind of what interests me most. Is the interaction of popular culture and politics and society, and particularly how you can see in the culture, in the songs and the books and later the movies, the fears and the aspirations of the people, and also how that then shapes what the political response to the situation should be. I think, as I say, it's that interaction between them I find fascinating.
Yeah, and of the books I mentioned, I've obviously mentioned the one book there, but there's many books that you've written about different periods of history in the last sort of 120 years. In terms of change, how would you rank the Edwardian period? I mean, albeit quite short, 14 years or whatever. How would you rank the Edwardian period in terms of the amount of change that was happening compared with other periods in the last 120 years?
It's a bit like the 1970s, which were neglected for a long time because they're sandwiched by in the case of the 70s, the 1960s and the 80s, which are very, very noisy, self-advertising decades, who demand to be paid attention to. And this is a definite period. And you get these odd bits in between. The 1950s, similarly, where it's a kind of neglected period a bit because it's falling between big, noisy bits. And the Edwardians are very much like that. As you said at the beginning, that you've got the Victorian 19th century, you've got the Great War, and then this weird little interregnum between them. But it's often those periods where there really is genuine change happening. There's a lot going on underneath the surface that it just doesn't draw attention to itself in the same way.
What are you currently working on, Alwyn? What's your next project?
The sequel, Britain Between the Wars, which will be another 18 months or so before it's published, but is coming along very nicely. And another interesting time when it can be overlooked a bit. There are the big events that we know of. There's the Depression, the abdication, the general strike, these kind of high points of knowledge, but then quite a lot happening underneath that is maybe not so well remembered.
Yeah. And what's your process for writing? I mean, do you have a particular process for writing a book? Obviously, you do your research in that, but do you set yourself a certain time every day, or how does it work?
No, the first 12 months or so is trying to immerse myself in the period as much as possible. So I will read novels that are written in that period. Now I'm on to a period where I can look at the movies that were released, listen to the music, and above all, read the newspapers. It's no longer the case because newspapers have taken such a heavy battering over the last couple of decades. But from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, there is a real role for the newspaper and the local newspapers as much as the nationals. That idea that your local paper will cover national and international events, but from a local perspective. My grandfather, who died in the 1980s, never took a national newspaper. He read the Express and Star, which came out of Wolverhampton. That was sufficient. That will tell you everything that you need to know. And yeah, I read a great deal of newspaper material, just trying to get a feel for the times. And I think it's a time when it does genuinely have that. Partly because there's so many titles, you have to reflect your audience's, your readership's interests.
Yes.
Otherwise, they will go elsewhere. There's too much competition for you to remain aloof from them.
Where can people find out more about your work, Alwyn?
The books are widely available. I would recommend Little Englanders. I think it's a very good book.
I'd second that. Well, Alwyn, this has been a really fascinating conversation. It's been interesting to learn more about the Edwardian period. And for me, the book brought to life some of those more colourful aspects of what everyday life was like for people living through the period. My guest today has been Alwyn Turner. Alwyn is a cultural and political historian, senior lecturer in history at the University of Chichester, and is author of the book Little Englanders, which I can thoroughly recommend. And you can find links to Alwyn's work and his book in the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Alwyn.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great fun.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.